Hi. As Alex said, I've been doing this sort of thing for a little while. The obligatory second slide, now that I've told you that this is everyone's second slide, you will not be able to stop seeing it in every presentation. This is the one where they establish their bona fides and you're like, but you're on the stage, I'm already listening to you. You don't have to convince me, it's okay. But yeah, I live in Minneapolis. I newly work at Microsoft, so I had to carefully drop the Microsoft logo in on this slide. I podcast with Arrested DevOps, and I am the head of the Global DevOps Days organization. I think we're in 50 or 51 cities worldwide on 6 continents. So if you would like to run DevOps Days Antarctica, talk to me, because it would be nice to level up and get that last continent. Okay, so the title of my talk, you may have noticed, was a lie. And if you were sitting there looking at it thinking, but wait, like, you're not wrong. There's a lot more complexity in our, massively scalable, fault-tolerant distributed systems that Alex was referring to that we're building. There's a lot more complexity than the easy glib, oh, computers are easy, people are hard. I think the hard with people comes in when you realize that, just like we were hearing in all the keynotes this morning, there's a lot of human components to open source. There's a lot of human components to our technology industry that we may have spent a great deal of time optimizing all of the places that our automated systems can fail, but we sometimes gloss over or ignore the parts that we know perfectly well things can go wrong with the way our humans interact. We just don't spend as much time on it. So let's talk about it. For example, if we're gonna talk about automation, if you look at this line, like in the last week there were 67 deploys of 496 changes by 18 people. Some of you are thinking, oh, that's a slow week. And some of you are thinking, yeah, it would be really nice if we could do that. And like the funny part is, this is from the Flickr dev blog in 2008. And at this point you're like, oh, but wait, they're web scale or something. Like, they're not like us. It's like everyone actually can operate at this speed, at this scale, but it's not usually technology getting in the way of them being able to do that. It might be your change control review board, but I think that when we start talking about exciting new technology, a lot of times people start thinking about, oh, well, there is that development team that wants to do everything with containers. And then there's these people who want to bring in this open source project that we maybe haven't completely vetted, and we're not sure if we're ready to go to production with it. And there's always that sneaking suspicion that maybe some of the people are asking you to work with whatever insert exciting new piece of the technology stack and risk your whole business on it, like, because they would like to work with that thing. Like, I've actually been in a meeting where someone said, I would really like to build a custom message, message bus. And I was like, why? And he goes, because I'd like to build a custom message bus. It's like, well, okay, I mean, if that's what you really want to do, but is that helping your organization get to its goals? And I think this is one of the things, like, I'm a technologist. Oh, by the way, fun fact, I majored in computer science partially because I didn't want to talk to people. Spoiler alert. But a lot of times we get really excited about the technology, but our organization's mission might not be do some exciting technology, put it on your resume, rinse, repeat. Probably. Most of our organizations don't have that as a mission. I mean, I work at Microsoft now, so we have a mission around empowering people throughout the entire world. And it's written on the back of our badges. I haven't memorized it yet. I've been there for 5 weeks. But it's, I think it's really important when we're making technology choices to think about it, to frame it in this way. So like, trying to figure out how we get there, I think this is where we can fall down a lot. My old boss at Pivotal, my good friend Andrew Clay Schaefer, likes to, this is his rendition of, the elephant or whatever. And I think it can feel kind of buzzword compliant and kind of ridiculous to say, it can't possibly be true that every single thing you do in your day is magically DevOps, jazz hands. Like, really? Like, let's talk about things that actually get us to our goals. And I think it's important to realize that the ecosystems that we're building our technology in and that we already exist in. I mean, I'm how many, like, show of hands, how many of you get to operate in a completely greenfield environment where you never have to interact with anything that already exists in the world? Right? Either everyone's asleep or, like, I see one person who I think is just adjusting their glasses, right? It's like, we're dealing with really complex ecosystems that have been built over time that exist for a reason. Presumably, if they didn't matter, we would just turn them off. But it's like, oh, the legacy thing, we might want to ignore it, except we can't, because like that's where the customers and money live. And that's where open source is really important, because you don't want the really important thing that your business or that your organization's mission depends on to be impossible to update. And also perhaps the vendor went out of business. Like, open source is a survival strategy for a lot of our organizations, because we would very much like not to have somebody else's business choices prevent us from having our mission. And I think it's also really important to like maybe name check this kind of ridiculous meme that we keep hearing about like disruption. And sometimes people are just talking about like the startup that maybe will do a small slice of what some other business does, and so like the existing business should be really worried. And in some cases, sure, yeah, maybe they should. And in other ways, it's like, this is not very disruptive in that it's very expected. Like we're all expecting and creating innovation all the time. It's kind of like this is a game of Settlers of Catan where the pirate ship is coming to attack, and you might not know exactly when it's coming, but it's coming on a pretty regular schedule. Like it is going to happen, and just being prepared for the innovation, let's call it, that's going to happen is another reason that it's really important for us to be working in this open source space. By the way, quick sidebar rant. When I talk to enterprises that are excited about bimodal IT, I just want to say like, so what are you going to tell to the people who you're putting in sad mode and telling them they can't innovate or do anything interesting or do any resume-driven development at all or learn or change? Like, how long are they going to keep working there? The ones that stay, how invested are they going to be in your organization? It's like while you're not going to change absolutely everything inside your company at the same time, you also aren't going to want to separate people into you're going to learn and you're going to just keep the fires burning. Like it's really bad, again, from the human side of things for your people to feel like they are in maintenance mode and will never get to do anything interesting again. I should also, like, speaking of innovation, like we spend a lot of time in our industry celebrating pioneers, celebrating first movers, celebrating the startup, celebrating the entrepreneur, celebrating that exciting new idea that somebody YOLO'd out to production and that somebody else probably is on call for, and maybe it's going to work, and maybe there's a lot of failure cases that you haven't thought about. And like if you look at Simon Wardley's Pioneers, Settlers, Town Planners model, I really like the settlers. Like, okay, cool, we have something that works for some values of works, but can we scale that up? Can we have it keep working after you update it again and again and again? And like that idea of being ready to scale stuff up is, like operational maturity. And it also has a lot to do with, do we have the open ecosystem that we'll be able to keep working in? And this is why open source is so important. By the way, even if my Kitten became, a complete expert on all of the technology represented by the stickers he's sitting on, which, he doubtless did. But even if you get everything working day one, it is really important to think about those day two operations, those day two concerns. Just because even if you are all about new product development, presumably you want there to keep being money to be able to develop new products, and that's not going to happen if you can't keep the ones that you've developed running. Especially because, much like attack kittens grow up, the code that you push to production, I have some bad news for you about how much of that code is going to keep running long after you no longer work there. If you used a credit card today, you probably interacted with a mainframe that's been running for 40 years. And it's like, we get really excited about new things, but we also want to create sustainable, maintainable, updatable things, because every sedimentary layer of reality is going to keep existing. Like it's very rare to completely rip out and replace anything. And so I think this is why it's really important for us to have some degree of empathy for the people, again, back to those human factors, the people inside our organization who maybe their incentives are set up slightly differently, and maybe they really don't want to let us change something. And it's probably just because they're terrible people and hate us, right? Maybe, probably not. They probably have a whole set of incentives set up around whatever the outputs of that system, that previously working system are. They have some incentives set up that they need to keep getting value out of that. So if you really want to YOLO your new thing out to production, okay, I mean, that's cool, but think about why the testers might be saying no, or why the security team might be tearing their hair out. Like, there probably is a reason. It's just maybe not one that you have to have a lot of personal interaction with. And this is why we get really excited about tooling and tech. And I mean, I'm totally on board with that. Like, after this conference, I'm actually leaving after lunch and going to another conference, but then I'm gonna go home and play with Azure Container Instances. Like, we get into tech because we're excited about this stuff and we wanna play with it, but we also do need to be able to interoperate with our team members. And, you know, in this role at Microsoft, I roll up through products. So like anything that I do figuring stuff out about, hey, when I showed a demo of this at a conference, people didn't really like this part and they were really curious about that. I got to take that back to product and documentation. There's a lot of interconnected human pieces that aren't necessarily just about exactly how that particular feature worked. And I think we get really excited too about doing the innovative thing, whatever that innovative thing might be. And like, I got news for you, right? I rolled a bunch of microservices out to production in 2014. You know, it was 2014, so we were obviously moving from a Python Django monolith to Go microservices, because that was the style at the time. And it was exciting, but it also meant that our failure states were just different. Like, oh no, we have microservices, but spoiler alert, all of our problems aren't gone. We just, we moved the problem around. Like, instead of like a whole bunch of IPC, we now have, network congestion is like new things to worry about. Okay. So this is the classic wall of confusion it's very common in like your DevOps talks. You've probably seen this before. This is from Andrew Clay Schaefer, some years back. And the idea being that development is throwing code over the wall to operations, who's presumably being pummeled by it and awakened at 2:45 in the morning, I think is the time frame that Kelsey was telling us about. And I think I would remix the wall of confusion to be a little bit more like this. And because it's set up around what your incentives look like inside your organization. And as I was mentioning before with incentives, if you have teams that are tasked with focusing on operability and, reducing downtime and MTTRs and all of those acronyms, if your teams are incentivized around that, they're going to be very concerned when somebody wants to change something. Maybe somebody wants to change something in a really, disruptive way that maybe hasn't been tested with the kind of traffic you'll see in production. Also, spoiler alert, you can't actually test with the traffic you see in production until you get to production. That's why you need like canary releases and, A/B testing and blue-green deployments and that sort of thing. But, okay, so like specific advice to people who are tasked with operations is, I know when I was, I was on call for production for about 15 years, which is where all the ops cynicism comes from. And I think that a lot of times when I would tell developers, like, they couldn't touch anything, they didn't like that, but you also can't just tell them, good luck, have fun, don't call me when you get paged. Like, that's not gonna help either. You need to actually produce systems that are comprehensible and documented, where you've actually shared the access and the information so that your developers can participate in the full life cycle of the services. And a lot of times when people are say they're developers and maybe they're building something with an endpoint and they're trying to figure out like, how to keep those, instances in the load balancer or whatever, it could be very tempting to have the endpoint always just return 200 OK. Like, yes, I mean, if the endpoint always returns 200 OK, no matter what happens, your instances will definitely not get bounced out of the load balancer. They may or may not be actually functioning correctly. So, like, thinking about what your code does when it's in production is really important, especially around debuggability and like the reality that code in production is going to hit circumstances that might not be that happy path that you're going to find in your earliest test cases. And quick word on documentation. So no one wants to document, understandable, it's kind of boring, and it does feel like anything that you write is going to be outdated anyway. But I would challenge people to make sure that at least when you're committing the code, at that moment you probably have the most context. So if you say why, not just what the code does, but why with the commit message, then someone like next year, maybe you 6 months later, will be sitting there angry at past you because past you was like fixed. And you're like, oh, that's great. That's fantastic. That doesn't tell me why you made this change that I'm now trying to unfurl the dependencies of. So I think we talk a lot about hard problems in computer science. I mean, obviously, cache invalidation and naming things and off by one errors, right? These are the hard problems. And there's a lot of joke tweets around this, idea. And I would go with, it is actually really hard to not say, I'm right, you're wrong, and start from a position of you want to just argue with this person because they're wrong. And I think it's human nature. It's very typical. I mean, maybe not all of you. Maybe you're all wonderful people who never feel this way. But it's very typical for me, at least, to start from a place of frustration. Why does someone else not understand why I'm right? Oh, we're back to those human factors, pesky humans. But until all of our coworkers are robots, we're probably going to need to interact with those pesky humans. And I think that this, by the way, is a 19th century French publication that clearly predicted today's video conferencing. I think these people are trying to, use audio on a video conference and failing horribly, probably. At least it seems like every single piece of video conferencing software is terrible. Some are less terrible than others, but they're all terrible. But the idea is any time that we're interacting with technology, we're almost always, I'm not going to say always because there's always exceptions, but we're almost always interacting with technology because we want to do something else. We don't desperately want to find out everything about audio, video, video conferencing. We all probably know more about it than we want to, but it's a means to our end of having better communications with people. So I think it's really important, I think, to center the people part because that is a lot more essential to our success, as an industry. We heard from, people on stage this morning about having been in the industry for 20 years. I mean, yeah, I've been doing this since the 90s, and I can assure you, almost every single, well, except for VI, I still use that every day, but almost every single thing that, we used regularly is different now. And yet, the industry still persists. I think this is another Clay Schaffer quote, and I like this because the kinds of conversations that we have, the trends come and go, the conversations ebb and flow, and I feel like we do get really excited about, exactly what our pipeline looks like. And it's okay, I mean, that's great, but you're going to get that code out to production one way or another, and it'll be running in production for a lot longer than, that instant of deployment. So how it actually operates in production, having some ability to answer questions about your systems is also super, super important. This is from my spouse and I had our 20th anniversary in March, and we decided to take a trip hiking in Iceland, which I highly recommend. It's very cool. But one of the things that I don't know if I would have actually walked on this glacier if we had gone without a guide, because if you can see the sign, it says like, attention, natural hazard, calving an unstable glacier, do not pass this point. It's like, wow, that sounds really dire. But our guide was able to tell us, oh, actually, as long as we go over here and we do this, it'll be fine. And I was thinking, all right, how much documentation or how many steps in your deploy process say something where you're like, oh, you can disregard that. Like, that's not actually true, and you don't have to worry about this specific thing, and we always skip step number 38. And it's like, I think everybody works someplace that has something like that, and it is because it is hard to constantly update the state of all of the other humans in a form that they'll be able to consume on demand. Like, that's actually really hard. These are the hard problems. So that's why I think it's really important that we build systems and services that can answer ad hoc questions on demand. Because we're never going to be able to, like Kelsey was talking about in his keynote, we're never going to be able to predict everything perfectly ahead of time. Like, if you've worked in tech for at least 5 minutes, you probably are nodding and thinking, yeah, I mean, unexpected things, those horrible unknown unknowns will always happen. And so, like, having the ability to introspect our systems is super important. And, like, kind of sidebar on how we used to do monitoring, we basically used to do it by setting, a certain amount of, like, fences and parameters and, like, trying to store or, query the state of, our disk and, like, our servers and our processors, and our processes and, what the load average looked like. And trying to go from, there's a high load average to, is this an actual problem? Is non-trivial, right? I mean, like, I used to, years ago ran Hadoop clusters, and the load average was always super high, but that meant that work was getting done. It didn't mean that they were about to fall over. So then you're like, okay, so do I have to set some checks that look at, like, state changes over time? I mean, again, like, you want the way you monitor to actually answer questions about, is work successfully getting done? Like, if all of our servers are somehow off and yet we are still successfully processing transactions, wow, I guess we completely converted to serverless. Like, we're done, hang a banner, go home, like, mission accomplished. But I think it's a very iterative process. And again, this is the sort of thing where if you want to change the way the monitoring and alerting happens in an organization, there can be a lot of pushback, especially if it's like, well, am I going to get paged for these other things? That if I get paged because of a bunch of 500 errors coming out of the application, and I'm very ops focused, and I don't know what those 500 errors are, I don't think I want to get paged with those. Okay, but let's figure out how you can understand what they are, because this is your job. Like, again, back to the initial value proposition of your organization. You're running those servers for some reason, probably not just to keep a data center happily warm. All right. Another thing I always come back to is Conway's Law. And if you're not familiar with it, it's this idea that organizations that design systems will basically create an organization that looks like the system, that looks like their communication structure. So I think there's an old joke about something like, oh, you have, a 4-pass compiler. Interesting. So you had 4 different teams on this? Yes. And it's like, well, I think that the most important word in Conway's Law is communication, because you don't necessarily need to have, like, everything broken out into, like, super tiny feature teams or whatever, if the people who need to talk to each other to build the features are talking to each other. Like, your org chart does not have to completely perfectly match the product suite that you ship, but you do need to have communication across the org. You can't just have everybody broken down into, that's the security team, we're afraid of them. Sometimes pizza goes in and, like, anger comes out, and we just try to avoid them. Like, if that's what you have inside your organization, you need better communication between the teams. And I bet if you've ever tried to solve a problem and you don't really want to open yet another ServiceNow issue, and someone who can answer your question and at least help you route to the right team, like, a lot of times those cross-team communications speed up things inside organizations, even though it's not the official flow of communication. But it's also, it's kind of a double-edged sword too, right? Because if, Chris over in operations is the one who always helps you, and then she's canoeing and doesn't have any cell signal, do you not get anything done? Or do you have to make friends with yet another ops person? Or what if somebody gets a super exciting new job at a competitor and leaves? It's there's a lot of reasons that you don't want to just have all the communication inside the organization rest on whether or not Chris is happy with you today. So I think it's important. I know this is kind of an eye chart, and I'll put the slides online afterwards. But in this one is also, you can see it at designhacks.co. And I like this chart because it talks about cognitive biases. And when we're trying to get that shortest path to an answer, when we're trying to solve a problem inside our organization, when we're trying to find that one person who's going to be able to short circuit things for us so that we can get to our goals that much faster, we're taking in and processing information and coming to conclusions really quickly. The way the human brain works is it's a really interesting hack. But the way it works is we have significantly less logical processing than we might think we have, because we take a lot of shortcuts. We take shortcuts in order to be able to come to conclusions quickly. And we take shortcuts to not be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. And this is all deep-seated evolutionary stuff that also, unfortunately, leads to actual biases in outcomes and biases in how we interact with people. I can give an example. At one point, I was running a team of operations engineers. We were called sysadmins then, because it was the early 2000s. But running a team, and our on-calls were kind of strenuous, mostly because we had a data center in the basement of a 100-year-old library, and sometimes the building would flood, and sometimes our water-cooled doors would stop working because the pumps would stop sending us chilled water, and it was a whole thing. And there were supercomputers. Pro tip, you do not want your supercomputers to overheat, because that's very bad. And so we had a pretty bad on-call rotation, and we had a developer offer to join the on-call rotation, because I think he was really sick of there was no Git installed on the supercomputers, and I just told him to use SVN because I was that way. I was terrible. But so he said, hey, if I can get run on the supercomputers, I would be in the on-call rotation with you. I said no to that. Looking back, I'm that was so foolish. That would have been another person in the rotation, another week before I would have to be on call again. And because I had that human hindbrain leaping to enemy, that developer is an enemy, cannot give enemy root. And it's you know what? Everything is a lot more nuanced than that. But sometimes when you're making those shortcut decisions, you're trying to act quickly, and you're not necessarily acting right. So, all right, so what do we do about that? I think if any of you remember the left pad incident, a lot of this, if you don't remember it, last year there was an NPM module that basically led to a huge amount of outages when there was a problem with it. And when we're ratcheting right back to the communication around our uptime and around our availability, we do own it ourselves. We have to take responsibility for it. That does mean if we need to share that responsibility with people, communicating with them and documenting for them. So we have to invest in, our architecture, obviously, so it's not a complete disaster, and our observability so that we can introspect and ask questions about our architecture. There's a friend of mine is doing a startup called Honeycomb, by the way, that you should totally check out. Honeycomb.io is all about observability tooling. And then also a culture where we're willing to talk to each other about these problems. So basically, I get really frustrated. I've been working at a vendor for the last couple of years. I just switched from Pivotal to Microsoft, but I would be in a lot of meetings where people really wanted to talk about, their DevOps initiative, because they were definitely going to do DevOps in Q3 this year. And I'm okay, we're not going to be able to deliver that to you on account of not a thing. But you can't no matter how many containers you have, they are not going to give you DevOps. And like, you should probably keep grain in your silos and not the different members of your organization, because that silos, by the way, fun fact, the grain dust in silos is highly combustible. So they're very dangerous. Your organization could explode if you had silos. And also, like, hey, I work at a cloud provider now, but I still have to tell you, when people tell you that their exciting initiative to repair all of the communication problems inside their organization that are leading to deployment slowdowns is to go to the cloud, and you're like, huh, you realize those are someone else's computers, but we're still gonna have all the same problems we had before. It's like when people have serverless, and it's like, okay, that's cool, you have computers you can't SSH into. This did not solve the part about how the change control review board is angry at you. Like, it's not going to solve those things. So I think we get really, we feel blocked by looking at all of these, especially if we're at an organization that is trying to make all of the changes and update and change all the things. And it seems like it's really difficult, and there's so much new tech coming up every day. And you're like, how many clusters of what do we need to orchestrate? And this seems like we have a lot we have to do all of a sudden. By the way, this was, I took this on Lake Superior. That's my spouse standing there looking at the frozen wall. And I'm standing out on the frozen lake. So, this is a couple of years ago. But I literally turned just a little bit, and instead of us having to climb that wall, we could just walk around it. It's like, Andrew Clay Shaver likes to say people over processes over tools. And that's basically, hey, look, there's a little person in there. Look where the other people are. Collaborate and cooperate with them. It gets a lot easier. It really, really does. And that's the DevOps magic. You don't buy it, and you're not going to get it in a box unless you get it in this box of chocolates, which were delicious. DevOps Days Belgium 2014, they were speaker gifts. It's like, yum. But other than that, like, you're not going to get this magically sold to you or handed to you by anyone, but you definitely can create it by collaborating across your teams. So that's it. I'll chat. Happy to talk. Thanks.